The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've got something really interesting and a little different for you today. So in the wake of everything that happened in Charlottesville a few weeks ago while we were actually on summer vacation, tensions have remained really high around these debates over whether Confederate statues in cities around the South should be removed or whether they should stay. And the statue debate is sort of centered around statues honoring Confederate leaders or Confederate soldiers or states of the Confederacy. And any serious person at this point realizes that the main point of the Confederacy's actions in the Civil War were to preserve slavery, right? And they will sometimes say, well, it was about states' rights. But one layer below that is that it was about maintaining a state's right to have slaves, regardless of what the federal government said. And if you look back at the economies of many Confederate states, you'll realize that they were totally dependent on slavery, period. So that the sort of academic debate at the time over states' rights was very low on the list of priorities compared to the reality that if they can't have slaves anymore, it is going to impact their economies. And if you look at the timing of when the Confederate monuments and statues were put up, it was around, number one, around 1900, between 1900 and 1920, when states were enacting Jim Crow laws to discriminate against black people and segregate society. And then you had another wave of it in the 1950s and 60s as a direct backlash to the civil rights movement. So even if you could argue sort of academically that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, which you can't because it was, you can then look up what motivated putting the statues up in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century, and you can very quickly see what this is about, okay? So over the weekend, there was a neo-Confederate anti-government militia organization in Tennessee that calls itself the New Confederate States of America. They traveled to Richmond, Virginia, and they held a demonstration in front of Richmond's statue of Confederate General Robert E. And there are actually several statues of Confederate leaders in Richmond, Virginia, and these far-right demonstrators came in support of leaving every statue where it is. There were only a few dozen of these neo-Confederate protesters who showed up. Most of them were openly armed, not surprisingly, but it did provoke a really big peaceful counter-protest by thousands of people in Richmond who are in favor of taking the statues down. And what's most hilarious about this grouping coming to Richmond is how counterproductive the decision was. All that these neo-Confederate protesters succeeded in doing was sparking a huge counter-protest in support of removing the statues, which outnumbered them by about 100 to 1. They created awareness for the opposite cause. And I'm showing some of the video of the counter protests on the screen. This has been gathered by producer Noah Ferguson working alongside Mike Shea down in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, if you're not aware of the history of Richmond, there's a very long and tumultuous history when it comes to race relations. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Richmond was the largest slave trading hub on the East Coast during the 19th century. Once slaves were kidnapped in Africa and sent to the East Coast of the US, Richmond was usually the first place they stopped, and there they were confined, auctioned off typically to other slave traders who would then distribute these slaves throughout the South of the United States. Historians and anthropologists say that most African Americans today would be able to trace their ancestry to Richmond, Virginia. And because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, there are huge monuments memorializing Confederate leaders in the heart of the city, including, as I mentioned, Robert E. Lee, President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. There are high schools in Richmond named after these people. And for years, there's been a lot of debate at both the state and local level about removing these statues in Richmond, Virginia. And after the events in Charlottesville, Richmond's mayor, LeVar Stoney, said that the Richmond city government should consider removing the monument. So this militia group shows up in Richmond on Saturday. Counter-protesters show up. Absolutely no violence from counter-protesters, right? We did a long-form piece recently about the myth of the violent left. The left were not the violent ones in Charlottesville, and they were not violent in Richmond, Virginia either. 7 people were detained. 4 of those were detained for wearing masks in public, which is illegal by statute in Virginia. So I want to get to some of the interviews with these folks here. And Noah Ferguson and Mike Shea doing a really, really good job on the ground in Richmond, Virginia. Let's start with some people who like the statues and say states' rights as a refrain as to why we had the Civil War in the first place.
What about the people that wish they had the freedom to take the statues down because to them it represents slavery and oppression?
Why would it be slavery and oppression? It's not anything to do with slavery.
Right.
I mean, history books, if you read in the history books, it was state sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. And then we've also got another example of people talking about states' rights. Let's take a look at that one.
What about the people that when they come down this avenue, they say it reminds them of slavery, of being oppressed?
Go up that next avenue. Don't come down this avenue. If you don't like it, go up the other avenue.
Right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, lots of people were armed. Why were they armed? Here's one guy explaining why he's armed.
I see you're armed today. Why did you bring a gun?
Second Amendment to the Constitution, written in by Thomas Jefferson, specifically iterates that we have the right to bear arms to protect ourselves from enemies both foreign and domestic.
Who are your domestic enemies?
That would be an out-of-control federal government.
What about President Trump?
I believe in what Trump's doing.
Oh, yeah.
I think he's good. He's a businessman.
This guy quotes from Thomas Jefferson on the Second Amendment. He also gives this line about, well, my domestic enemies are tyranny by the federal government. That's often attributed to Thomas Jefferson. That line has not been found in any of Thomas Jefferson's writings, period. Now, would this guy care about that? No, he wouldn't. And clearly, this guy is the sort of ideologically committed Trumpist that we've talked about. Now, here's another couple of guys. One who says that counter-protesting is something that people do only when they're in kindergarten. Also, this guy equates Confederate generals to Abraham Lincoln and defends slavery. Take a look.
I'm here because I would like the monuments to stay.
Getting out here and yelling and screaming and acting like you're in kindergarten or something other's not doing nothing. It's just making people hate you more. If you don't like it or agree with it, well, look, you got Lincoln up there. I don't like him. I don't agree with that. Let's take that down. I don't like Lincoln because of what he stood for and what he tried to do and for his northern aggression war that he put onto the South to take our rights away. Slavery's gone on since the Ice Age, you know.
Right. What was the Civil War fought over?
It wasn't fought over slavery, that's for sure.
That's just the best. There's been slavery since the Ice Age, so Lincoln was wrong. Also, people counter-protesting, okay? Noah and Mike did try to talk to some of the Antifa types, but they actually received death threats for wanting to film them. So here are non-Antifa counter-protesters that Noah and Mike spoke to. Actual African-Americans explaining why the presence of these Confederacy-era monuments is not good for them. Take a look at this.
What do you have to say to the people that say, hey, this represents my heritage?
So I'll tell those people their heritage is based on treason, because those people fought against the United States. That makes them traitors. They are not heroes. They didn't do anything but cause this huge 4-year war that killed a lot of people.
All right, here is another counter-protester talking to Noah and Mike in Richmond, Virginia.
Well, the monuments represent hate, you know, they represent a terrible past in this country, and I think they should be removed and put in a different place, like a museum, you know, or like some of the burial grounds, cemeteries. That's a better place for them, not right in the middle of our cities. All right, and so we need to move them to where they should be, where they can be looked at in context, not looked at in the 21st century.
All right, and here's just another couple of counter-protesters. We'll hear from them as well.
What do you hope to accomplish with this march?
We hope to awaken some of these white extremists.
Well, the Civil War was clearly about slavery. People who say it's not are dissembling.
So listen, the Civil War is over, right? These protesters' claims about history are just wrong. Doing this and saying these things in Richmond, of all places, is sort of the height of absurdity. Now, on the issue of whether or not slavery was the central issue of the Civil War, Are these people just uninformed? Is this an educational issue? Are they victims of filter bubbles and echo chambers? I've been talking a lot about that in the course I'm teaching at Boston College. And ask yourself this: why do the 4 years of the Confederacy warrant so much commemoration in contrast to the other 400 years of history in the South, right? Why does the Confederacy hold such a special place in the hearts of these people? Is it because it was sort of the last stand for states' rights? Not really. I mean, we've had endless Supreme Court decisions in favor of states' rights since then. So why is it? It's hard to make an argument, Pat, that it's about anything other than a sort of melancholy reminiscence about slavery.
And where else in the world can you find this? You're talking about a campaign of people who attacked their own country, responsible for over 600,000 deaths, all for a putrid reason as slavery was, and then they get commemorated for it 150 years later. It's like a participation trophy.
And here is the connection to the modern politics of 2017. What we're seeing is people emboldened by Donald Trump, period. That's why this is resurfacing, and we need to beat it down figuratively, right? I'm not advocating for violence, but it needs to be beaten down. Peaceful counter-protests are a tool. And I don't agree with those who say, hey, ignore white supremacists because all they wanted is attention. You've got to connect the dots here, right? You have to understand how the rhetoric of the president of the United States connects to not only the resurgency in white supremacy, as we've heard of from former neo-Nazis and KKK members on the program, but how it connects to policy proposals, right? The Muslim country travel ban, the Mexican wall, white supremacist terror in Charlottesville. You can't in any real way deal with that by ignoring the neo-Nazis. You just can't. And, you know, burying it in terms of discussion will actually provide cover to the elements out there, and they exist, that want these policies to go forward. So I encourage you, do not do it. Send me your thoughts on Twitter, what you think about these interviews, and we will continue having this conversation because it's a really important conversation to have. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Caldwell Dugan III. Caldwell, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. We are a viewer and listener supported program. I implore you, if you like this show, if you want to support the work that we do, please consider throwing us a few bucks a month, either through membership at davidpakman.com/membership or through Patreon at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. And also remember, if you ever shop on amazon.com, the shopping you do can support the work we do if you go to davidpakman.com/Amazon every time you shop. So here's an interesting little story, a letter I received. We did a story a couple of weeks ago called What Are Crazy Reasons People Have Canceled Memberships? And among some of the different stories I told, I mentioned a guy who emailed me saying, David, I like your show. I like what you do. I agree with your politics, but you are a bachelor and I am a married man with 3 kids, and we're about the same age, and I disagree conceptually with taking money away from my family to fund your bachelor lifestyle. But great show. Love the show. We'll continue to watch. And my reaction was, listen, that's totally fine. I decide whether to support worthy causes financially based on the merits, not the marital status or family situation of the other person or of my situation. But hey, to each their own. I got a very, very nice letter, which I'm going to put up on the screen for you, from Christie. And I'm not going to mention Christie's last name. There's many, many Christies. Doesn't matter. This is just someone who wrote to me, who said, David, I heard you talk about a person who wanted to know how you could ask for money from single moms to support your bachelor lifestyle. Well, I listen to you on the radio every day. I've been wanting to become a member for months, but I haven't yet. I'm a single mom of 3 kids. No support from the father. 1 child has special needs and requires therapy, and I can't work a traditional job, so I do whatever small jobs I can, and I'm starting a business this fall. But I heard you say that this guy said this, and I became a member today. I may have to cancel at times and then come back, but that idea ticks me off because you aren't trying to sell me something I don't need to trick me into giving up my money I need for my family so that you can get rich. I rely on your show and other progressive shows like it to know what's happening so I can plan how to defend my kids from what's happening around us. Just wanted you to know that families like mine do value your show. Thank you for everything that you do. What a nice letter from Christie. And there are many people, there are many people in our audience who make a lot of money, and they don't necessarily support the show financially, and that's fine. There are many people who, because of their financial position, understand the importance of the issues we're talking about and the issues we're activating around, and that's why they support us. And I could not thank Christie enough. What a nice letter. And I encourage you, join Christie. Support the work we're doing. It is a tough time for the show. We've got Patreon. Even just $1 a month through Patreon means a lot at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Membership is available. davidpakman.com/membership. There's a coupon code. I voted 17. Whatever works for you, whatever amount works for you. Don't think that because you can't contribute much, it's not worth contributing at all. Because through many small contributions, we've built the program that we've built. I want to talk about what happened in London on Friday. There was an explosion on the District Line train at Parsons Green Tube Station, Tube being, of course, the British subway. It's being treated as a terrorist incident by London police. 30 people were treated in hospitals or urgent care centers. It was mostly burn injuries. 19 of the 30 were taken to the hospital by ambulance. 11 were in okay enough condition to take themselves to the hospital or to urgent care. ISIS almost immediately claimed responsibility through an affiliate, but that's really no surprise. And Amber Rudd, who's the Home Secretary in England, says that there's no evidence of any actual connections to ISIS beyond maybe, a shared ideology. The perpetrators were not initially apprehended, so there was a manhunt. An 18-year-old and a 21-year-old have so far been arrested. Unclear whether these are the perpetrators or were involved with the incident in some way. And what I want to talk about is the true, very real and very serious danger that Donald Trump's reaction to this event and to other events are having. Donald Trump tweeted very shortly after the incident, before we really knew much at all about what had happened, quote, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who were in the sights of Scotland Yard, must be proactive." This contains all sorts of really dangerous stuff. First of all, public criticism of a major ally before we even have any information, it's a diplomacy disaster, absolute diplomacy disaster. And for now, diplomacy still sort of matters. British Prime Minister Theresa May called the comments not helpful. You think that's what she wants to be dealing with, or what we want to put her in the position of having to deal with after a terrorist attack in her country? Immediately, this causes Trump's lieutenants to have to go and do damage control. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster came out and said, what the president was communicating is that obviously all of our law enforcement efforts are focused on this terrorist threat for years. What does that mean? Adding, Scotland Yard has been a leader as our FBI has been a leader. Trump then followed up minutes later, and we'll get to some of his other tweets, but this brings us to the facts, right? Is it true that Scotland Yard had these perpetrators in their sights? We don't know the answer to that. If so, was that classified information? Again, classified information from an ally shared with us, not to be made public, that Donald Trump goes on Twitter and tweets. But interestingly enough, the answer might actually be a lot dumber than any of that. 23 minutes before Donald Trump tweeted that Scotland Yard was aware of these perpetrators, Fox and Friends on Fox News had a security analyst saying that he feared that the London police already had the identities of the attackers. Feared that they might know the identities is, of course, nothing like have been tracking these particular people for some time. So either Trump is spreading rumors that the attackers were in the sights of Scotland Yard, or he's leaking information yet again that he has no right to leak. It's disturbing for a 71-year-old man to be doing this, particularly if he's president of the United States. Minutes later, Trump goes back to Twitter as part of this demented rant. 2 minutes later, and he tweets trying to defend the travel ban, saying, quote, "The travel ban into the United States should be far larger, tougher, and more specific, but stupidly, that would not be politically correct." Based on what was known then, what actual data do we have that the type of travel ban that Donald Trump wants in the United States would have actually prevented this attack in London? We have none. But this influences policy. People see this stuff and they believe, yeah, look at what happened in London. We should have the travel ban. Hey, just ban all travel, right? I mean, no one can blow anything up if there aren't passengers. And why wasn't Donald Trump this mad about what happened in Charlottesville? Then he needed time to think calmly about his response. And then Donald Trump took aim at the internet, saying on Twitter, quote, "Loser terrorists must be dealt with in a much tougher manner. The internet is their main recruitment tool, which we must cut off and use better." Hell yeah. I mean, ban the internet, right, Pat? That's how they recruit, except for the online stores where you can buy Donald Trump's MAGA hats that are made in China. Other than that, we've got to shut down the internet for these folks.
It's interesting that you bring up that Charlottesville point, too, because he said at that time that when he makes a statement, he wants to be correct and he wants all the facts on the ground before commenting on it. Remember, he would say the same thing over and over again, like there's good people on both sides, there's bad people on both sides.
Not here.
Repeating himself, trying to diffuse the situation, but for this one, he's willing to rush to judgment.
Minutes after, he hears something similar on Fox and Friends. And what really scares me about this is that Trump is using sort of a failed, 30 people were injured. It's terrible. It could have easily been much, much worse. Trump is using an effectively failed subway attack in London to justify a ridiculous travel ban in the United States. What would Trump do if we actually had, and I hope we don't have it, a major domestic terrorist attack? If he uses a failed attack in London to justify harebrained policies, what is the guy capable of if we have a major attack in the United States? This is not American exceptionalism. This is the growing realization from foreign powers, both friendly and unfriendly, that Donald Trump is a live wire, that he can't be trusted. And that's something that our allies, Trump doing this after a close ally has an incident, allies would see this and rightly say, we've got a distance from the U.S. We just don't need this right now. And it's also something that plays into the hands of our adversaries. Our adversaries would also use against Trump that the guy is unhinged and can't control what he says in social media. The Twitter rant, when you read it, Pat, and you consider there's been an attack in London, right? If you take a tweet in isolation, it's easy to write it off and say, it's Trump being Trump. He says what's on his mind, except when it's Charlottesville and it would make sense to be quiet for days. The rant in total is the ranting of a true madman lunatic. That's the reality of it.
I really think that he could avoid half of the trouble that he gets into if he just deleted the Twitter account or delegated it off to someone else. I mean, why is he continue to beat himself over the head with this? It's just unforced errors time and time again.
That applies to the Russia investigation, right? I've talked about that. A lot of what's going on with Russia is related either directly or indirectly to subjects that Donald Trump has broached on Twitter. If you saw your local supermarket manager tweeting stuff like this on Twitter, you'd look at replacing the supermarket manager because it's unhinged and it really doesn't look good. This is the president of the United States who is going on these rants and still has, and actually, his approval rating has been ticking up. I don't know if you've looked at this. Oh, it's disturbing. I looked at the Gallup daily tracking poll. He hit a low there of about 34, 35%. It has been steadily higher. I mean, it's still not great, right? But it's been solidly close to 40 now for about 10 or so days. I might talk about this tomorrow. I don't know yet. But there is a contingent of the country that is not going to turn on Donald Trump. And that's why we can't wait for people to just wake up, right? I mean, we were waiting for people to wake up all of George W. Bush's first term. Guy got reelected.
Maybe it's because he's been working with Democrats a little bit more, and I think it had been a little bit of time since his last Twitter rant.
Yeah, anytime that you can get some distance from Twitter, that's worth a 1.5 to 2.5 approval points, no doubt about it. This is really scary, and it's not about, I know we like to put up tweets and we laugh, right, because it's all so silly. This should be concerning to everybody. This is now a national security concern for the United States. Donald Trump treating allies in ways that if we were them, we would say, look at how we're being treated by the president of the United States. we need to stop sharing information with them. We need to reconsider our alliance with those countries. And I know that there are Trumpists who believe we don't need anybody else. We're the best and Trump can do it all, and our national security and military, we can do it all. But this is an entire planet, and we do actually need the support and alliances that we have. And seeing Donald Trump single-handedly destroy them day after tweet after day after tweet should scare all of us because of what it means for the future of the United States. Discuss this with us on Reddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm welcoming to the program today James Damore, who's a former senior software engineer at Google. He was fired for writing an internal document that criticized the company's culture and diversity practices. So, James, you've really been doing the interview rounds lately, and as some of our mutual Twitter followers have pointed out, that they've seen you mostly do interviews with, I guess, what would fall under the umbrella of right-wing media. But as far as I understand, that's not because that's what you've been seeking out, right?
Right. I've really been giving interviews to most of the people that have asked. And it just happens that I get very few long-form interview requests from people that would identify on the left.
Why do you think that is? Like, in other words, why has there been this sort of, why do you believe there's been more interest from the right in interviewing you?
Well, I did give several interviews to CNN, Bloomberg, Business Insider, and so I did give interviews to the left, but I feel like they were very hostile, and the audience's reaction was actually, they were on my side, and so it didn't look good for them when I gave interviews. That may be one, and I think they're just not willing to really engage me in any long-form discussion because what I'm saying doesn't fit their narrative.
That's interesting. So, one of the things you're saying is it's possible that the left has not been interested in interviewing you because it hasn't gone well for them.
Yeah, that's at least one theory that I have.
That's interesting. And in what way has it been reflected that it didn't go well? I mean, certainly, I think if you asked, for example, CNN about it, and you said, hey, a lot of the audience sided with James Damore, I would be shocked if they said, yeah, we can't have that. That's not good for us if people side with James. So in what way do you think it was reflected that it didn't go well for them?
Well, it just seems like they're not fair, maybe. Just based on the comments, a lot of people would dislike their videos and point out how they just didn't like how they treated me.
Interesting. Well, let's get into, I reviewed the memo you wrote again this morning in preparation for our interview. And there's been very general sort of assessments made of this memo that was the start of you ultimately being fired by Google. There are those who describe it as a sort of evidence-based document about gender differences. Others say that you're perpetuating gender stereotypes. What would you say is sort of like the primary thesis of your document about Google's diversity policy?
So I think a lot of our culture is really intolerant to ideas that don't fit their ideology. And I was trying to present the ideas that really go against some of the left's biases and use that data to try to help us increase diversity. So look at the ways in which psychology has shown that men and women differ on average, and perhaps make our culture and our working environment more appropriate for some women.
And what would be an example of how a workplace, and if you want to make it specific about your former employer, Google, and even as your department within Google, I'm sort of fine with that. That might be interesting. What might be a change you'd suggest to make the environment more appropriate for women as you describe?
Yeah, so if we just look at some of the average differences, women being more cooperative and sometimes less assertive, we can really try to promote people that are cooperative. And so those that help on multiple different projects without being the team lead for a particular project. Because in our performance reviews, it's really looked positively if you're the team lead. And it's hard to judge or if you're someone that only helps on the project. And also, we can restructure our team meetings to really make it so that it's not just the most assertive person talking the entire time.
That's interesting. And so make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, are there specific gender differences you've identified that would make women suboptimal to be team leaders in the way in which they would be expected to be at Google?
I think maybe, yes, there are some expectations that are put on team leads that we expect them to be more masculine in some ways. And that may not be relevant to their actual work performance. And so that we should probably change.
And in your estimation, in the research you've done, do you believe that difference between men and women in that particular sense, you mentioned this assertiveness thing, you also talked about women being more prone to anxiety in the document that you wrote. Do you believe that those differences are biological or sort of cultural, nature or nurture, as the phrase often goes?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of both, and they combine. And it's really hard to disentangle one from the other, but there are reasons to believe that there are biological roots to a lot of these. For example, women with high prenatal testosterone have many masculine traits, and even within the world, different cultures have different gender gaps in this. But it's that the societies that treat men and women more similarly, those have the largest gaps. So the more prosperous countries seem to allow men and women to act how they normally would, or
talk about that. What do you mean normally would? What would be the baseline for normality in terms of gender behavior in your mind?
Yeah, so maybe normally is not the right word, but just if you need to act a certain way to even survive, then you may be doing that. And so one example that's relevant to STEM is that even within the United States, if you look at the lowest socioeconomic status, there's actually not really much of a gender gap in STEM. But then when you go to the higher economic status, there's a much larger gap. So men, it stays about the same, but women drop out and go into social work a lot of times. And so there's sort of an economic necessity to go into STEM because it's high paying when you're a lower socioeconomic status. But if you're richer, then you really don't need to work in STEM if you don't want to.
And James, you mentioned that some of the gender differences could be related to sort of like what people need to do to survive. In 2017, do you think that it's a matter of survival, these gender differences, like assertiveness and anxiety in corporate culture, for example? Can we really point to survival as the necessitating factor between those differences?
Not necessarily survival, but really what you want in life. And people generally, if they start out poorer, then they generally do want to be richer, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a very general statement. Yes, if you are poor, you probably would rather not be poor. I'm very interested in this topic, and I found that the reaction when Larry Summers at Harvard had said something about figuring out if there are differences between men and women when it comes to predisposition to math, or it was something I actually don't remember exactly, but I remember thinking that some of the initial reaction was sort of overblown, because I do think it would be really important in society to be able to explore that. Like, why wouldn't we want to know if indeed there is something biological that makes men or women predisposed to excel or struggle in certain areas? But to take one of the things you just said, this idea that in countries where men and women are treated more similarly, you see larger gaps in some of these areas. I did quite a bit of research over the last week, and what I found was that the more egalitarian a society is, the smaller the gender differences become in terms of performance in science and math. So in other words, when one example would be a Villanova University psych department study called Cross-National Patterns of Gender Differences in Mathematics, what they found that was when women were most secure and affirmed, that the difference between their performance in math and science and that of men almost goes away completely. And that seems to be at odds with what you said.
No, so I'm not really interested in the actual ability of men and women. It's more the personality. And in those societies, the personality is what diverges the most. And so a lot of the reason why there's a gap in STEM is not that women are necessarily worse in math or science. You know, women are actually doing better than men in pretty much every field in schooling. But they just choose to go into different fields at some point. And you know, one of the largest reasons why there are fewer women in these STEM fields is that, yes, men and women have about the same quantitative ability on average, but women tend to have higher verbal ability. And especially among high performers, men are much more likely to be only good at math and quantitative things and not so good at verbal, while women are more likely to be well-balanced. And if you're well-balanced, then you don't need to work in STEM. You can work in law or other fields that require verbal ability, while the men really just need to work in STEM.
Now, that's very interesting to me because, correct me if I'm wrong, part of your criticism of the Google diversity policy was that it was trying to sort of impose some kind of hiring equality, 50-50 equality between men and women that might not correlate with what you believe might be the best fits. But the argument you just made, which is, listen, there are lots of men who are only good at math. They're not so good as women at verbal skills. So by overhiring women in the departments where being good at math is sort of a prerequisite, you would be hurting men's opportunity to be hired. Isn't that just the exact policy you're against, just meant to disproportionately hire men in these departments? Like, I'm hearing the exact opposite of the policy you're criticizing.
Sorry, I don't see how that's exactly the opposite. I'm really just saying that if in a world without any discrimination and where we treat men and women exactly the same, we wouldn't expect 50-50% of women interested in working in tech. And that was largely the thesis that I was trying to counter in the document, because that is something that I heard over and over again at Google, that, oh, if only we were able to get rid of all the sexism, then we would have 50-50.
Okay, but my point was, if you're saying, listen, women are really good at lots of other types of jobs by virtue of having better verbal skills, as you said, and there are lots of men who wouldn't be good at those jobs. Therefore, we should be hiring more men when being good at math is the sole prerequisite. Isn't that the same type of sort of direction of saying we need to hire more men because they're not going to do as well in other jobs, but you're being critical of the hiring of women for the exact same reason? I'm not sure if I'm expressing myself clearly, but does that make any sense?
So I'm really not saying that, oh, we should hire men because of this. I'm just saying we shouldn't discriminate when we're hiring. And if our natural hiring, like, we wouldn't expect women that are both good at math and verbal to necessarily choose STEM. And we shouldn't, we sort of infantilize women in this way, where we say that we know what's best for you. And even though these women are choosing to not go into STEM, we're sort of guilting them because, oh, you can work in STEM, you know, this is not just men's work. But when they really just prefer something else, we're guilting them. And
what would be an example of guilting women into going into STEM? Like, in what way have women been guilted into going into STEM?
Yeah, so I hear multiple anecdotes of people that went into STEM or coding simply to show that women can do it. And then they end up dropping out later because they didn't go into it because they were passionate about it. They were just into it because they were pushed into it.
But I'm surprised to hear you as a former senior engineer, right, at Google, to use a few anecdotes that you've heard of to show that the guilting of women is really the problem you describe it to be. Like, I know of one man who went into nursing because he felt there aren't enough male nurses because of the stigma that women make better nurses. But the fact that I know that one guy doesn't really tell me anything empirically, does it?
Well, yes, but so we can go off of, we don't need to use anecdotes. We can look at the dropout rate of tech, and it's much higher for women. And when you look at the reason why, it's often that they simply want a different type of career. So there's differences in what type of career men and women want, and the field that STEM is often characterized as realistic, and that's one that has a large gender gap. So realistic being, working with systems and things. And if you look at the women that drop out, the biggest predictor is whether or not they want a career in realistic fields.
Okay, let's pause there. We're speaking with James Damore, former senior software engineer at Google. We will take a break and continue our conversation with him.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's an interesting world politics story I want to talk about. September 25th, the date has been set for a referendum on the independence of the Iraqi Kurdistan, and that day is getting closer and closer. It's just days away at this point. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who I am no fan of, as you know, I won't restate why, most of you already know that, said last week that Israel supports the creation of an independent Kurdish state, a country for the Kurds, right? An independent Kurdistan. And this isn't hugely shocking. Back in 2004, Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Kurds deserve their own state. So he's been consistent. And it's also not just Benjamin Netanyahu that has this position. A few days ago, Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked said during a conference at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya that Israel and countries of the West have a major interest in the establishment of the state of Kurdistan. I think that the time has come for the U.S. to support the process. The connections between Israel and the Kurds go back about 50 years. And in the 1960s, Israel had covert relationships with some Kurdish factions. And there are sort of some overlaps in ideology as well. If you survey the Kurds compared to other Iraqis, you would see that the Kurds are way more likely to want separation of mosque and state, right? Their version of church and state. This is interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, in one sense, it makes sense that Israel would support an independent Kurdistan, right? There's this shared history of statelessness as well as of persecution that was the driving force in the creation of Israel. So that part is logical. And there's another angle as well. Mosul has basically fallen in Iraq, and that's been a big drag down of ISIS in the region. If you think about adding to that Kurdistan as an independent state, it even more fragments the region, and it arguably negatively impacts Iran as well. And you can see the evidence that Iran is sort of understanding this, because Major General Mohammad Bagheri, who's Iran's armed forces general staff chief, has called this referendum for an independent Kurdistan, quote, unacceptable. Iran doesn't want it, and it's very clear why. The leader of Iraq's National Wisdom Stream, who's Ammar al-Hakim, has actually suggested that Israel itself had a part in instigating the referendum. Anybody surprised, right? You never want to lose an opportunity. If you are Iran or Iraq or whoever, you never want to lose an opportunity to say, it's actually the Jews that are behind whatever else it is that's going on. And there's a lot to be debated about how much an independent Kurdistan would actually impact Iran. But there are those who are reflectively anti-Israeli, and they see, oh, Israel supports an independent Kurdistan. And they say, well, you know why Israel wants that, right? They want to seed chaos and lack of unity among Israel's enemies. Of course, the other position, which is much less conspiratorial, is that, listen, having another official independent entity in the region that's not openly hostile to Israel, that's just a good thing, regardless of your view on Israeli foreign policy. The Kurds are generally sort of comparatively secular. They almost completely identify as Muslim, but remember that secular is not atheist. Secular refers to separation of religion and government. So there's actually a pretty obvious alignment between Israel and an independent Kurdistan, certainly more than what the flat-out Israel haters are making it out to be. And I find the discussion of the Kurds to be a really, really interesting one. And we've talked about this on the program many times before. We did an interview, a really good interview, actually, with Stephen Mansfield on the YouTube channel. Members also would have access to the full show archive. It's called "Can We Trust the Kurds to Fight ISIS?" And it was a story we did. I did not have the highest expectations of how much attention it would get. I thought it was a really important interview to do with Stephen Mansfield. But the interview has done incredibly well. The issue of the Kurds is very interesting. There have been some really good investigative pieces about the Kurds, certainly by 60 Minutes. I think by maybe PBS Frontline as well. We've covered it. And I think that this is going to be, when you think about the future of the Middle East, there are a number of different sort of discussions to have. ISIS, what happens in Egypt, what happens in Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the influence of Saudi Arabia, but certainly on the list is the future of an independent Kurdistan. And I encourage you to check out that interview. Okay, we've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail. And I want to present this to you. What do I want to say about it? This is Troy York. Okay, regular caller Troy York. Here is Troy York. He seems to think that he's figured out the real problem with polarized politics in the United States. And maybe no surprise to some of our viewers, the problem is that I'm a foreigner causing problems in the U.S. Take a listen to this.
Yes, Mr. Pakman, your lack of knowledge on politics and traditionally how politics is run is inexcusable. You have no knowledge. It's because of people like you, mostly foreigners, is why we have this bipartisan political division that can't get nothing done. What Trump is attempting to do is return to the days where Democrats and Republicans actually work together as they're supposed to get legislation and deals done. And
right.
Listening to your podcast again shows your lack of knowledge and inexperience in even discussing these subjects. And you really should be working at a drive-through at a Hardee's. Mr. Pakman, bipartisan politics gets nothing done, and deal-making is essential for a democracy, especially one that has more than one political party. But I guess coming from...
All right, let's cut it. That's good. You know, somehow I don't think the fact that I was born in Argentina is the source of lack of bipartisanship in the United States. It's very difficult for me to believe that that's the case.
Sounds to me like Troy York has to plug his phone in.
Yeah, he was on low battery there. You gotta plug your phone in. I love Troy York. I really do. He calls up with this stuff, and it's so out of nowhere. All of a sudden, the problem is that I once visited Israel. All of a sudden, the problem with American politics is that I was born in Argentina. I kind of envy being able to reduce all of our problems into such simple explanations.
Maybe we should start flattering him more, and then he'll go away. I mean, that's how you have to treat the trolls, right?
He seems to only call back because we discredit every single voicemail that he leaves. He'll call back with his other, what is his Hispanic character?
Oh, no.
Luis, I forget, he has this character, Caesar, I don't remember. But Troy York has 3 or 4 different characters that he calls in with. Anyway, on today's bonus show, yet another incident where a sign language interpreter was communicating nothing with his hand signals. And a report claims that 40% of American adults sleep with a teddy bear. And I have a very difficult time believing that that's the case. Those stories, and also a discussion about some format changes to the David Pakman Show, all upcoming on the bonus show. davidpakman.com/membership to sign up. And of course, patreon.com/davidpakmanshow also now gives you access to the bonus show and the commercial-free TV show. Sign up whichever way is best for you. The bonus show is next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.